Hello everybody. I can't believe that the semester is almost over. A few months back, we just presented our introduction. And now it's time to showcase our final presentation. Being a teacher and a student, I decided to talk about something related to education. So I hope you enjoy watching this presentation. Education has evolved over the passage of time. Many educational reforms have taken place. This presentation aims to show the impact of boarding schools on the Alaska Native individual, family, and community. In 1867, Alaska was purchased from Russia. A few years later, the United States government began to exercise its educational dominion over the indigenous inhabitants. The goal of many educators at the time of mandatory boarding schools was to assimilate people of different cultures and ethnicities into a dominant culture. The educational policy was also aided and abetted by many of America's religious communities, which established their own boarding schools. At the government and religious-run boarding schools, the Alaska's native school-age children were taught American, European, and world history from a Western perspective, as well as principles and doctrines of Christianities. There are three major providers of the boarding school programs: the Bureau of Indian Affairs, religious institutions, and state-operated boarding schools. In the 1900s to the 1970s, Alaska Natives were taken from the rural communities. After the death from illnesses and disease of family members and relatives, there were a number of children that became orphans, and the boarding schools became their home. In some cases, where children were part of a family who had lots of alcoholism and lots of domestic violence, the boarding school was an opportunity to get away from the abuse and be in a different setting. But a majority of the children had no choice but to leave their village and be educated in the boarding schools when their village lacked either primary or secondary school. For those that attended the boarding schools, the benefits focused on skills and knowledge learned. They were given the opportunity to learn about the world beyond their village and state. They were exposed to a broader world. Many felt that this would not have happened had they attended school in their home communities. There were high expectations on students. Students exerted effort to meet the expectations. The broader worldview gave them tools to make more informed and bold career and educational choices. Some said that the boarding schools made them independent and self-sufficient. The discipline of the boarding schools gave them the tools to succeed in school, the military, and their careers. There were graduates who took higher education and became college graduates, and some enlisted and were drafted for military service. Lifelong friendships were developed at the boarding schools. The intense bonding was in part a mechanism for survival. Togetherness gave students comfort in the absence of their family. Extracurricular activities such as sports, cheerleading, art, and music classes were not traditional activities that are part of the Alaska Native cultures, but soon was part of their activities of daily living in the boarding school. The students enjoyed being part of different activities. For students that needed academic support, they were provided individualized care. The benefits the student gained from the boarding schools, however, do not outweigh the negative effects of the boarding schools on the individual. The comforts of food, clothing, shelter, and education came at a high price. Native children were to be taught reading, writing, and arithmetic in English. It was primarily taught in school, but reinforced in all facets of daily life. The Alaska Native children's cultural identity was not developed. Native educators were virtually non-existent in the boarding school. Native language, history, and culture were almost entirely absent as well in the curriculum. Native culture, heritage, and language were of no use, including singing, dancing, and drumming. It was a clear sign that all school-age children are being geared towards acquiring new cultural practices and traditions, and that any memory or recollection of native culture and practices be slowly diminished until it totally disappears. When the students came back to the village, they had difficulty getting reconnected with their parents and participating in activities. It was difficult for students to remember their native language. The children became more familiar with English and communicated in English, much to the dismay of their parents. Activities of daily living, which are learned through direct observation and participation, were now something that parents tried to teach their children in the little time they stayed with their families. Natives who were fortunate enough to complete their education returned home and had children of their own. Their situation was a frustrating dilemma. They were not fully accepted by the people because they no longer spoke their language or were able to practice their cultural ways. They were not accepted by the Western society because of the color of their skin. While many wanted to teach their children the ways and traditions of their ancestors, they simply can't. They were not confident to teach the children cultural practices, and the new parents lacked the knowledge and skills to impart to their children. Their parenting skill and ability to pass on tradition and cultural practices to the next generation was affected. Physical abuse is also one of the negative effects. If a student was caught speaking his or her native language or practicing traditional ceremonies and songs, he or she received a wide range of punishments. Students had their mouth washed with soap, sometimes put in a closet, or were ordered to sit in a classroom corner on high stools wearing dunce caps. Some students were spanked or whipped with belts and cat-o'-nine-tails, or had their knuckles wrapped by nightsticks and rulers. These traumas had a lasting effect on some students. They engaged in alcoholism, drug abuse, and problems with the law. It was difficult for them to go back to village life, and much more difficult to live to the expectation of what an Alaskan Native is. The family system was affected as well. Boarding schools were constructed away from the villages. This discouraged families from easily visiting their children. Family members were seen as a hindrance and distractor in the goal of assimilation. However, this setup was very traumatic for the Alaska Native families, and the villages were forever changed. The village that was filled with children running around and laughter became dull and quiet. There were no more children above 5 for those that didn't have elementary schools, and for villages that didn't have high school, the teenagers had to leave to a different place in Alaska, or if the boarding schools were full, they had to go to a different state. The family was not complete anymore, and it was not of their choice. This separation brought about a change in the family dynamics. It was difficult for parents to lose their sons and daughters, even though it was just for a few months. In a village, it was noted that 20 to 30 school-aged children leave the village yearly. The lack of having children in the community led some parents feeling distant towards their children. Some parents lost their desire to attend to the remaining children. It was hard for parents to see their children going to a different place just to be educated. Family life consisted of celebrating important events such as birth, family gatherings to celebrate and give thanks for animals that they hunted. However, the absence of school-age children, family celebrations may not be as joyous and memorable. Students were not allowed to go home for funerals and at times finding out about family death until when they come home at the end of the school year. Some Alaska Natives who die in the boarding schools and hospitals in Tacoma, Washington were buried in unmarked graves. This is painful for members of the families who were not beside their loved ones in the time of sickness and in death. All these affected the family life of Alaska Natives. It is in the simple activities that strengthen family ties and cultural identity is enhanced. The family is the basic unit of society. If the family is broken down, then it will be affected, and then the community's stability will be affected as well. Boarding schools have contributed directly to the loss of culture and also created identity conflicts. A society is built on the stability of each member of the community. When the youth was taken away, there was a temporary gap in the cultural transmission of traditions and practices. It led to the lack of feeling of being part of a bigger whole for some students. In 1976, the state of Alaska agreed to build schools in the rural communities having 8 or more school-age children. When these schools were built, it was no longer necessary to send Native children to boarding schools. Subsequent legislation and funding brought about sweeping, dramatic changes in the educational system in rural Alaska. During the first year after the settlement of the case of Tobaluk versus Lind, nearly 30 new high schools were established with staffs of 1 to 6 teachers and student enrollments in the new high schools ranging from 5 to 100. During the next 7 years, the state invested $133 million in the development of approximately 90 more village high schools. As of 2001, there are over 120 small high schools in Alaska villages. The effects of the boarding school might have lots of negative implications, but also served as a means for educational reform. Students today are growing up in a political, social, economic, and educational environment that is dramatically different from that of their parents and grandparents today. Today's high school students are the first to attend the same high schools their parents likely attended in their home community. Alaska Native culture is resilient. The boarding school program had a combination of good and bad effects on the Alaska Native culture. But I believe that paved the way for a positive direction towards educational reform. We can see now that the traditional ways of learning is incorporated in the curriculum specifically designed for students that are Alaska Natives. Elders are invited to become resource speakers, and here around our school I could see different projects that the students are doing to appreciate Alaska Native artwork. That ends my presentation. I hope you enjoyed watching it. Since I didn't learn any Alaska Native language, let me just say paalam, which is goodbye, and salamat, which is thank you, in my native language of Tagalog. It's been a great semester. I learned a lot from our professor and classmates. Till next time, this is Joanna. Goodbye.